Donald Trump is turning up the heat on Israel and on Hamas as he tries to stop his Gaza peace deal from falling apart. With the agreed ceasefire seemingly on shaky ground, the US president has warned that allies in the Middle East are ready to step in and, in his words, straighten out Hamas. But he's worried too about Israel's prime minister, with growing fears in Washington that Benjamin Netanyahu could derail the ceasefire and restart the war. With that in mind, President Trump has dispatched his number two to Israel. JD Vance's mission: calm the waters and get the plan back on track. The US Vice President is expected to meet Benjamin Netanyahu on Wednesday. Today, he announced the opening of a new command centre where a so-called international stabilisation force will monitor the ceasefire in Gaza. He later took questions from journalists and had this to say about the peace deal and its prospects of success.
What we've seen the past week gives me great optimism the ceasefire is going to hold. And if we get from where we were a week ago to a long-term, durable peace between Israel and Gaza, there are going to be hills and valleys. There are going to be moments where it looks like things aren't going particularly well. But given that, and given the history of conflict, I think that everybody should be proud of where we are today. It's going to require constant effort. It's going to require constant monitoring and supervision. That's part of the reason that Admiral Cooper and his team is here, is to mediate these disputes, to mediate these disagreements as they come up. But look, right now, I feel very optimistic.
Well, flanking JD Vance at that news conference was President Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and his Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff. They'd already been dispatched to Israel and today met with several released Israeli hostages in Tel Aviv. Both men played key roles in getting the US-brokered ceasefire over the line. Speaking alongside the Vice President earlier, Jared Kushner outlined more details about one of the key parts of President Trump's 20-point peace plan, the reconstruction of Gaza.
No reconstruction funds will be going into areas that Hamas still controls. And as far as the demilitarization goes, once the ISF is up, there needs to be a security force that they can feel safe from, that in order for it to be the transition to be complete. So that needs to happen. There are considerations happening now in the area that the IDF controls, as long as that can be secured, to start the construction as a new Gaza in order to give the Palestinians living in Gaza a place to go, a place to get jobs, a place to live. So that's one of the many things being considered.
Daniel Kurtzer is a former US ambassador to Egypt and to Israel. He's now Professor of Middle Eastern Policy Studies at Princeton University. Welcome to DW. Let's start with the presence of Vice President JD Vance and Special Envoy Steve Witkoff in Israel today. Does that indicate a strong US commitment to making this truce hold?
Oh, it certainly does. President Trump has extended himself quite significantly by declaring that he's the chairman of this peace board, and he has taken a very personal view of trying to get this deal implemented. So dispatching not only the envoys, Witkoff and Kushner, but also the vice president, I think is an indication that the president intends to take this quite seriously.
But here's the thing, we have seen deals come and go in the Middle East. We have seen pieces, we have seen bombs and missiles go off. Is this a White House with sufficient patience for the sustained, years-long effort that this deal will require to fill in all those missing details?
You know, we all hope that's the case, but I think it's hard to project that this president, with a very mercurial personality, whose views change from one day to the next, and who contents himself normally with posts on his social media platform, will actually have the ability and willingness to see this through. Now, he does have full-time negotiators. His name is attached to this plan, so there is a cost should he walk away. But this will require a tremendous amount of patience and persistence, which the president has not shown on almost any other issue.
Exactly. And there have been deaths since the deal was struck, with each side blaming the other. So let's talk about what role, if any, the US should play in enforcing and verifying the peace that it has brokered.
You know, if we look back at other ceasefires, both in the Middle East and elsewhere, they're never observed fully. There are always breaches from one side or the other. And so it is not unusual and perhaps to be expected that each side will find a way to pursue its own agenda. The problem with this ceasefire is that neither of the parties, nor Israel nor Hamas, really wanted to end the war. They were pushed into that on the Israeli side by President Trump, and on the Hamas side by a combination of Qatar, Egypt, and Turkey. And so you don't really have a commitment from the two sides to observe the ceasefire as scrupulously as they should. That said, the president, the vice president, and then the two negotiators seem to be watching this closely. So it's possible that they can keep the ceasefire intact. But I would be skeptical that this will be a error-free ceasefire.
Right. The US says it's going to contribute 200 troops to this force. As I say, this force will be based in Israel. But people will ask themselves, well, we've seen the shooting start despite this supposed ceasefire. So what will US troops do when the shooting starts again?
I think there's some utility for some American forces to be in a kind of oversight position, maybe a headquarters unit, not in Gaza itself. I don't think that's going to happen, but it could be in Egypt or in Israel. But I'm not sure why 200 troops are necessary. We have some Americans in the multinational force and observers in the Sinai. We've been there since 1982. But it's far fewer than 200. So I think that number is yet to be finalized. And I think it'll mostly be oversight and some headquarters responsibilities.
You made the point that neither of the two belligerents wanted to end this. This was the United States effectively banging heads together. Can the US retain its credibility as the main driver, the main broker of this deal, when it is so often seemed to be backing one side against the other? It is backing Israel against Hamas.
Well, I think that's going to be a key metric in determining success or failure. The Trump 20-point plan is very significantly a pro-Israel plan. It incorporates the 5 principles that were part of an Israeli cabinet decision. It requires Hamas to give up its arms and to give up its role in governance. And so the principles of this plan very much are in Israel's favor. Implementation is another problem, however, because should the Israelis respond more significantly than perhaps would be called for to an attack on them, then it's going to be a question with the United States try to hold them back. Will the United States put pressure on Israel with regard to the composition of the multinational force? Will the United States put pressure on Israel with respect to the composition of the technocratic Palestinian government, something that Prime Minister Netanyahu has said in the past he doesn't want? So even if the plan itself is very much in favor of Israeli interests, the question now is whether in the implementation phase, the United States will take a more balanced view.
There are some interesting symbolic, I suppose the whole thing is riven with symbolism, but some interesting detail in here. We heard from US Envoy Steve Witkoff saying that President Trump is comfortable with the idea of Mr. Witkoff meeting with Hamas directly. What would that mean for the US to engage with Hamas directly in this way?
Well, it happened once specifically for the purpose of conveying the president's promise that he would oversee the implementation of the agreement and that the war would not be restarted with American support. Whether or not that means that Witkoff has an open-ended agreement from the president to keep meeting Hamas, I think remains to be seen. Should that occur, there will be some blowback in Washington. Hamas has no support in the United States, particularly among both Republicans and Democrats in the Congress. And so a regular dialogue with Hamas, I think, is probably not in the cards. But if Witkoff and Kushner believe that for a particular purpose to bring Hamas on board an agreement that the two of them think is useful, then I think the president probably would allow them to meet them on a one-off basis.
Right. So where are we, do you think, in this overall process? We heard the president last week saying this is the greatest deal for peace in the Middle East since whenever. Do you see this 20-point plan for Gaza as a real path forward, or is this more about managing a fragile pause?
I would ignore the president's hyperbole. He likes the announcements. He likes the headlines. If you go down to the level of what's actually on the ground, what you have is a blueprint. It's not a detailed plan. The first elements of that blueprint have been implemented with problems, and they are engaged in the field now to try to figure out how to move to the rest of the plan through points 3 through 20. And it's going to be very, very hard to do so. In effect, these first few elements, the ceasefire, return of the hostages, humanitarian assistance and I know this is going to sound strange, but they were the easy part because that's been on the table for well over a year. The hard part now is what do you do on the day after to make sure that you simply don't go back to a status quo ante in which you have the two sides ready to go at each other on a moment's notice.
That's very clear. Thank you for guiding us through that, Professor Daniel Kurtzer from Princeton University. Fawaz Gerges is a professor of Middle Eastern politics and international relations at the London School of Economics. Welcome to DW. We just heard the US Vice President express optimism about the ceasefire in Gaza, despite the deaths and the outbreaks of fighting. Do you believe that optimism to be justified?
You know, I wish I had shared the Vice President's optimism. I wish I could be as optimistic as American officials. Since the ceasefire went into effect 11 days ago, according to Palestinian authorities, health authorities, at least 80 Palestinians have been killed, and Israel has violated the ceasefire 80 times, at least 80 times. The fact that the United States, the flurry of US activities into Israel, the Vice President, the two top architects of the ceasefire, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, tells you a great deal that the already fragile ceasefire is coming under strain. According to the New York Times today, this morning, it's the lead American newspaper, Trump officials have basically told the New York Times that they are very concerned that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is trying to quit the ceasefire. And my take on it is that when Trump officials reveal their concerns about the Israeli Prime Minister and they send the Vice President and other officials, tells me that the situation is very serious. And what we have seen is not just the violations of the ceasefire and the killing of the Palestinians, also the escalation of humanitarian aid has not happened in Gaza, according to humanitarian officials.
Let's take those points one by one. First of all, the 80-plus Palestinian deaths, I think more than 10 Israeli soldiers. What I hear from people who study the nature of ceasefires is you don't get, and indeed we heard from VP Vance, you don't get a perfect observation of ceasefires from day one. Infractions are always expected. What is it about these infractions and these deaths that make you think that this is more than just part of the process?
I think you're asking a very important question. I mean, yesterday, on Monday, the Israeli Prime Minister gave a major speech in front of the Knesset, the Israeli Knesset, in which he said very clearly, we will control over most of the Gaza Strip after the ceasefire, and we will disarm Hamas, quote unquote. I mean, this is his statement. He has, reiterated these points. Israel now basically occupies 53% of Gaza Strip. And according to the Prime Minister, his forces will never leave Gaza. So how do you end the war in Gaza if the Israeli army controls at least 50% of the strip? And the reason why many Palestinians have been killed in the past 11 days, because they are confused about the areas under Israeli control. And the Israeli army shoots first and basically does not really ask questions, after the killing.
Let me just interject there. I take your point, and that's well made. It therefore sounds like there is an inherent weakness in this Trump deal, this 20-point plan, not just in the lack of detail, which can be expected, but the fact that both parties, Israel and Hamas, have effectively been bullied into it and neither really want a ceasefire at this stage.
Well, by the way, I am really delighted that Israel's all-out war is over. I'm not talking about Israel renewing its all-out war in Gaza. I'm saying what we are witnessing and what we'll most likely witness is a low-intensity war as opposed to all-out war. That what we have seen in the past 11 days will become a template for what happens in Gaza. And Lebanon, by the way, served as a template. Israel signed a ceasefire deal with Lebanon more than a year ago. And Israel violated the ceasefire on a daily basis. According to the Lebanese army, Israel has violated the ceasefire in Lebanon more than 4,000 times. And we know that Gaza is much more important for Israel than Lebanon itself. So even though we should be delighted that the all-out war is over, I think the ceasefire in Gaza will be limited because the Israeli prime minister will never end his occupation of Gaza, at least 50-40%, and Hamas will never disarm and disappear into the sunset. Right. Hamas will be there regardless of what happened. And as we know, Hamas has already reasserted its control. It has basically now established itself as the dominant political and security force in Gaza after more than 2 years of Israel's war in Gaza.
We'll leave it there, Professor. Thank you very much for that. Professor Fawaz Gerges from the London School of Economics. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Well, for more on this, we are now joined by Mairav Zonszein. She's a senior analyst on Israel at the think tank International Crisis Group. Mairav, welcome back. Would you say that both sides, Hamas and Israel, are doing enough to uphold the ceasefire?
I think, both sides were kind of forced into a ceasefire by the Trump administration. It's a very, very fragile situation. Neither side is getting fully what it wants. Both sides have to make some concessions. Israel has largely destroyed Gaza. And we're in a situation where what's really keeping the ceasefire together is the Trump administration and some of the other actors that were involved in drafting this 20-point plan. But it's very hard to see how long that's going to hold if Israel and Hamas themselves don't see the incentive of continuing.
Now, once Hamas, talking about incentives here, once Hamas hands over the remains of all dead hostages, let's talk about Israel. What stops Israel from resuming the war and, quote, what they called finish the job in Gaza?
Again, it's the deceased hostages are returning in a trickle. They need to return, but there's also lots of Palestinians still under rubble that have to be recovered. Gaza has been largely destroyed. There is a lot at stake here. So it's very important to highlight how important it is that we've reached a ceasefire, no matter how flawed it might be. It's very, very important. And so what's keeping Israel from resuming is not just that it's gotten all the hostages. I think it's that Trump and the world have said that the war is over. Trump sat in the Knesset or stood in the Knesset and said the war is over. Netanyahu hasn't said that, but I think we're in a new phase. So I'm hoping that we won't see any kind of return to what we saw before the ceasefire was reached. But the danger is in staying in the current phase that we're in which people are still being killed and things are still very, very bad.
In your view, is there any appetite among the Israeli public to resume the war in Gaza?
I mean, there isn't. Israelis are exhausted, reservists are exhausted, but the hostages, the living hostages, have been returned, and Israel sees that Hamas is still standing, and there's a big concern. Now, Netanyahu has promised Hamas disarmament. I don't think that Hamas can be eliminated in the way that Trump has threatened. I don't think Netanyahu can promise Hamas disarmament, certainly not through force. And Israelis see that Hamas is reasserting its power in the Strip after 2 years of war. So they don't want to go back to what we saw, but they also don't want Hamas in power there. So it's really up to the sides and the mediators to figure out a way to reach an agreement in which Hamas is no longer in power in Gaza, but in a way that Hamas cannot be a spoiler, because Hamas is going to try and undermine that. And Israel is going to threaten war, a resumption of war at all times as well.
Now, what would you say needs to happen now to ensure that this ceasefire progresses to the next phase?
I think what we're seeing today with Kushner and Witkoff and JD Vance on the ground, I believe also Egypt is heavily involved in day after plans. We need to see more of that and a continued sustained role of that. And that's very, very difficult. Right now, it's happening. For the ceasefire to reach a new phase, that needs to continue. There has to be actors involved. Both sides need to be incentivized. So Israel needs to understand that there will be serious repercussions if it tries to go back to bombing indiscriminately in Gaza. And Hamas needs to understand that it's going to have to give up at least a certain amount of arms and levels of control in Gaza, as it has said it would to some extent.
Mairav Zonszein there from the International Crisis Group. Thank you very much, Mairav.